He sold the only car he ever truly owned, hid the heart disease that was silently killing him, and quietly paid the tuition for a girl who wasn't his by blood. But in her most important moment, she stood on stage and said, "This is my mom, and this is my mom's husband." No dad. No thank you, just silence. And that night, he collapsed alone in a cold garage. Some men never ask to be called father. They just love, quietly, until they can't anymore. Stay until the very end. You'll understand why some goodbyes are never spoken, but leave a weight on the heart forever. Evening quietly settled over a small house in the suburbs. Its beige walls faded with age, windows slightly cracked open to catch the first breeze of summer. Slanted sunlight filtered through the worn checkered curtains, casting broken beams of light across a scratched wooden table. The kitchen smelled of coffee and half-eaten pastries. At the head of the table sat Robert Taylor, his back slightly hunched, calloused hands gently holding a glass of water. In front of him lay a medical folder, one corner poking out with faint red letters that read, "Heart condition, monitor closely." He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. He had read it enough times to know where every word lived. Instead, Robert's eyes rested on the girl sitting across from him, the one he'd raised for over a decade. Eleanor Carter. Elena sat cross-legged on a worn wooden chair, phone in hand, her hair tied up with a cloth band, her eyes glowing like sunlight. She spoke, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I got the confirmation email this morning. It's official. They accepted me into Madison's honors program. I start this fall." She laughed, scrolling through dorm room pictures on her phone, chatting on as if the man across from her hadn't fallen into complete silence. Robert forced a smile, so strained it hurt even him. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," he said. "You've worked so hard." A second passed. Elena didn't look up. She didn't see the deep creases forming at the corners of Robert's mouth or the red fatigue weighing heavy in his eyes. She didn't notice he called her sweetheart, like he always did. But she didn't answer with Dad. She glanced up briefly, then smiled lightly. "Thanks, Robert." That was it. Not wrong, but not quite right either. Like a name that's just polite enough to avoid awkwardness, and just distant enough to never be mistaken for blood. No trace of kinship hiding in those 3 syllables. Robert looked over her shoulder. The acceptance letter lay half covering another sheet, yellowed, creased, stamped with red. Final notice, hospital payment due. Eleanor didn't see it. She was talking about choosing classes, about the Paris study abroad program for sophomore year, about the honors scholarship she might qualify for if everything stays on track. Robert nodded slowly. His eyes blinked with effort. There were things he couldn't say in this moment, because if he opened his mouth, he might not be able to stop. And he didn't want to dim her smile. Not today. Not when her eyes sparkled like a child about to take flight into her own future. Let her have a little more joy, he thought. Her joy is the only thing left helping me survive this pain. Night had fallen. The house went dark early. Sandra was already asleep in her room. Elena had gone upstairs too, leaving the kitchen empty, lit only by a soft yellow glow from the corner light. And the steady ticking of the wall clock like a quiet reminder that time was running out. Robert stood at the door to the garage. His hand rested on the cold metal handle, hesitating for a moment, then slowly turned it. A soft click echoed. The door creaked open. Inside was a different world. Private, worn, filled with memories. A 1973 Mustang lay silent under a silvery grey tarp. Dust settled thinly on top. Under the pale ceiling light, its black paint shimmered faintly like ripples on still water. Every edge and corner of the car was familiar to Robert's hands, because he had rebuilt it himself, bolt by bolt, door by door. "You used to be the only thing I had," he murmured, his voice low as if speaking to an old friend. That car was more than transportation. It was part of Robert, the part that carried him through the wreckage of his first marriage, the part he retreated to whenever the world felt too heavy. It was also the first place Elena had ever sat behind a steering wheel, laughing wildly as he let her play with the horn. He ran a rough hand over the hood. It paused at the faded horse emblem, worn down by time. He inhaled deeply. The air was thick with oil, rusted metal, and memories. Then he pulled the tarp off. The next morning, before the sun had even risen, Robert drove the Mustang through 2 towns to an old gas station. Waiting for him was a middle-aged man, a classic car collector. No haggling, no back and forth. "She's a beauty," the man said. "Engine still run?" Robert nodded once. "Better than anything inside me," he said with a faint smile. The money was exchanged. So were the keys. The buyer drove the Mustang away while Robert stood motionless, watching the taillights fade into the early mist. A cold wind passed, but he didn't shiver. There was just a stillness in his chest now, as if a piece of his past had driven off, with no promise of return. When he got home, everyone was still asleep. Robert pulled out his phone, opened his banking app. With a few simple taps, he transferred the full amount into Elena's tuition account, the one he'd quietly set up 3 years ago. She never asked where the money came from, and he never told her, because some acts aren't meant to be explained, only remembered by those who can recognize the shape of unconditional love. The morning Elena left home to begin her new journey at Madison University, the front yard was soaked with dew. A silver car from her best friend's family waited at the gate, trunk open. Another father sat behind the wheel, indicator blinking softly. Robert stepped out from the garage, carrying the final suitcase. Quietly, he slipped a brown envelope into the outer pocket of her luggage, his voice gravelly. "In case you ever need it. For an emergency." Eleanor turned and offered a small smile. "I'm not a kid anymore, Uncle Robert." For the first time that morning, Robert's eyes flickered. The word uncle had rolled off her tongue so naturally, not out of malice, but without hesitation. As if an invisible boundary had been drawn, one he would never be allowed to cross. Sandra held her daughter tightly, whispering all the usual motherly reminders. Robert, meanwhile, just stood by the porch, eyes locked on the car as it began to roll forward. No dad, no goodbye hug, just a stepfather, standing in the doorway, nodding silently as the car, and the laughter of youth, disappeared down the road. In the early weeks, Elena still called regularly. Every Sunday night, 7 o'clock sharp. She spoke about her classes, her dorm, the grumpy professors, and the burnt brownie her roommate tried to bake. Robert didn't say much. He just asked, "Are you sleeping well? Eating okay? Need me to send you anything?" Though she never called him Dad, he still waited an hour ahead of time, headset ready, lighting adjusted, wiping the camera screen until it gleamed. But then came week 4. A message arrived. "Too busy to call. Next week, okay, Uncle." Then the week after, "Got a presentation tomorrow. We'll text later." And slowly the messages grew shorter. "I'm good. Heading to study group. Love you guys." No more bursts of laughter. No more endless stories. And of course, no more calls that began with, "Hi, Uncle Robert." Still, Robert kept his Sunday ritual, sitting on the sofa, hand resting lightly on the phone, screen unlocked, volume at max. Most of the time, nothing happened. Just the pale blue light of the idle screen casting soft reflections on his sun-worn, age-lined cheek. Sandra would pass through the room, seeing this sight so often that she knew that posture by heart, more than any morning greeting. One evening, while folding laundry in the bedroom, Sandra paused. She looked over at Robert, quietly folding an old newspaper. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. Robert smiled, but his eyes didn't. "It's good she's busy. She's young. She's living her dream." Sandra nodded, but her gaze never left him. She recognized how he spoke, like a man trying to convince himself that the silence didn't hurt. But she knew. It did. This wasn't distance of geography. It was a different kind. Silent, invisible, but undeniably real. The distance between a father who was never called father and a child who didn't realize she was slowly forgetting the man who had walked her to the threshold of life. A cold, early winter rain poured onto the tin roof one Saturday night. The soft pattering wasn't loud, but it was just enough to keep the sleepless even more restless. Robert opened the attic door, a small flashlight in hand. Each creaky wooden step groaned under his weight as he climbed. The attic was dusty, cold, and still, so silent he could hear his own heartbeat. In the far corner, he pulled out a faded silver tin box. Written across the lid in black marker, Elena, childhood. Inside was everything a father had quietly saved: a pink bike helmet with chipped paint, a pair of frayed ballet slippers with tattered ribbons, a crayon-written card that read, "My family is special because Uncle Robert makes me laugh when I'm sad." Robert held the card in his hands. He sat there in silence for a long time. Those innocent words had once meant the whole world. Now they lay still, like proof of something that once existed and was slowly fading away. He sat down on an old mattress he had laid out like a makeshift chair, pulling out a worn notebook and a blue ink pen. He clipped the flashlight to a beam above his head, its glow angling across the page. He began to write, "Elena, I know. Or rather, Uncle knows he's not your biological father. I never tried to take that place. I only ever wanted to be there, at parent-teacher meetings, in the audience at your awkward school plays, during the nights you cried over a disappointing test score. I don't need you to call me Dad, but I've always hoped you'd treat me like one." His hand trembled slightly, ink bled at the corner of the page. Still, he kept writing. "The Mustang. It was the last thing I held on to for myself after my first marriage fell apart. I restored it bolt by bolt. But when the school sent your tuition notice, I didn't hesitate. Because if you were ready to fly, then that car had no reason to stay. If someday, when you're old enough to read this letter without resenting me as the outsider who interfered, then I only ask you to remember one thing. It's not the one who gave you blood, but the one who stayed when everything else left. Who is your real family? Love you, Robert." He folded the letter with care, smoothing each edge perfectly. Then he placed it into a plain white envelope, unsealed. On the front, he wrote, "To Elena." The script slanted gently, just like his hand had always trembled while signing parent forms at school. The letter was never taken to a post office, never left on the kitchen table, never texted or scanned. He simply placed it softly into the center of the tin box, amid the world of childhood Elena had already left behind, and closed the lid. Downstairs, the clock struck 2 a.m. Sandra was still fast asleep, but in the attic above, a man had just folded up his heart. One more time. The invitation arrived on a Monday morning. A thick envelope, silver-trimmed, the recipient's name embossed in formal black ink. Mr. and Mrs. Robert Taylor. Inside was a card still rich with the scent of fresh ink. "You are cordially invited to the Honors Gala celebrating Eleanor Carter, Madison University's outstanding scholar." Sandra opened it first, her hands trembling with emotion. "Robert, she wants us there. Do you see this? She hasn't forgotten us." Robert said nothing, but deep inside something flickered. Not hope. Something more fragile, anxious. Because he knew some things couldn't be repaired with a pretty card and festive lights. That evening, Robert stood before the mirror in his old suit. The collar pinched slightly, the jacket pulled tight around his stomach. He wiped down his scuffed leather shoes and sat to tie the laces tighter. Sandra wore a simple navy dress, her hair pinned back with the clip he had given her on their 5th anniversary. They looked at each other through the mirror. No words, just a gentle nod. The gala hall at Madison was breathtaking. A towering ceiling, crystal chandeliers cascading like icicles, tables draped in white linen, silverware gleaming under soft lighting. A string quartet played classical music from a distant corner. Robert stood still, as if lost in a world that wasn't his. The scent of expensive perfume, polished conversations, hollow praises about academic excellence, it all felt distant. And then he saw her, Elena Carter, in a simple yet elegant black dress, hair neatly pinned at the nape, small earrings catching the light. She stood surrounded by professors and peers, glowing like someone long accustomed to center stage. Her eyes met her mother's first. She rushed forward, hugging Sandra tightly. "I missed you so much, Mom," she beamed. Robert lingered a step behind. Then he approached, his eyes holding out hope. For a hug. "I missed you too, Uncle." Or even just a familiar smile. Elena turned, her eyes flickered for less than a second. Then she smiled, polite, composed. Turning to the group beside her, she said, "This is my mother, and this is my mother's husband." 6 words, no more, no less. But to Robert, that sound was sharper than any blade that had ever sliced through his chest at a construction site. He didn't react, just tightened his grip on his hat and nodded to the unfamiliar faces. A few hesitated, glancing subtly, as if to say, "Oh, not the biological father." Eleanor had already turned away. Sandra, standing beside him, noticed. Her hand found his beneath the tablecloth, gently squeezing. But Robert didn't turn to her. He simply stared down at his shoes, the ones he'd polished for over an hour that afternoon, now dulled under the soft gold lights of the banquet hall. On stage, Elena's name echoed. Applause filled the room, but in his mind only one line played over and over. My mother's husband. He had given everything, but it still wasn't enough to be written into the story he had helped build. The honors gala ended at 9 p.m. People trickled out beneath laughter, camera flashes, and cheerful promises of, "Let's keep in touch." Elena was swept away by a group of friends for photos. Sandra stood near the grand staircase, watching her daughter with proud, shining eyes. And Robert stood farther back, quietly, in the shadows. No one noticed him. Not a single professor came over to shake his hand. Not a word of thanks from the girl they were all here to celebrate. On the drive home, no one spoke. The rented car hummed softly through the quiet streets of the college town, streetlights casting long, pale gold streaks across the windshield. Robert was behind the wheel. He had booked the car a week earlier, deliberately choosing the same model sedan Elena used to say she liked, as if telling himself, "This is a big moment. It needs to feel right." He just hadn't expected to be so completely absent. From the moment itself, Sandra sat in the passenger seat, hands clasped, then released, then clasped again. Robert didn't look at her. He didn't really look at the road either. His eyes were facing forward, but his mind was still trapped in the banquet hall, an hour and a lifetime ago. When they turned onto the narrow road leading to their home, the porch light flickered. That same old bulb, never quite fixed. The only thing waiting for them, as always. Robert stepped out of the car without a word. He loosened his tie as he entered the house, hanging it quietly behind the door. Shoes removed and placed neatly. Slippers slipped on. A routine carved by decades. But he didn't go into the bedroom, didn't take a shower, didn't turn on the TV. He turned left dash, toward the garage. The wooden garage door creaked softly as he pushed it open. The space was empty. A faded outline on the concrete floor marked where the Mustang used to rest, a shadow that refused to leave. Robert stood there under the dim yellow glow of the ceiling bulb. Alone, no one saw him, no one knew what he was thinking. But sometimes the things left unsaid are the loudest sound. In a night like this. The next morning, the sky was overcast. No rain, no sun, just a dull grey stillness. Much like the silence lingering between husband and wife in their small kitchen. Sandra stood by the sink, pouring coffee. Robert sat at the table, still in his faded grey pajamas, eyes fixed on a glass of water he never touched. No one mentioned the night before. No one brought up the words, "my mother's husband." No one spoke of the glances from the crowd, or how Robert had stepped half a pace back as Eleanor took the stage. Only silence remained, thick and heavy, like fog clinging to everything it touched. By noon, Sandra stepped into the bedroom. She picked up her phone and dialed Elena. It rang a few times before connecting. "Hey, Mom, I'm at the library. Everything okay?" Sandra hesitated for a few seconds. Then she asked, softly, but with a tightness in her chest, I want to ask you something. Last night, what did you call your dad in front of everyone? On the other end, silence. Then Elena replied, voice quieter, I said he's Mom's husband. Sandra sighed, soft but unmistakably heavy. Do you know how deeply that hurt him? Eleanor paused. Mom, I didn't mean to hurt anyone, but it's the truth. He's not my biological father. Robert had been walking past the hallway. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but he stopped, frozen, when he heard his daughter's voice on speakerphone. He's not my biological father. That's the truth. Just one sentence, but it was enough for all the carefully buried feelings from the night before to crash down like a collapsing wall. Robert didn't lash out. He didn't break anything. He didn't say a word. He just stood still. Sandra tried to keep her voice steady. Sweetheart, your biological father was never there. But Robert was. When you were sick, when you fell off your bike, when you cried over a bad grade, the man who held you wasn't the one who gave you life. It was him. Eleanor stayed silent. Out in the hallway, Robert turned away. His eyes landed on a photo hanging on the wall. Elena, at 8 years old, in a princess dress, smiling brightly at a school costume party. Standing next to her, Robert, wearing a blue superhero outfit he had sewn himself. A beautiful memory. Now, it felt like a fantasy. One where the main character was never acknowledged. Robert walked to the garage, opened the door. The room was still empty, still cold. He looked at the shelves of old tools, dried paint cans, scraps of wood from a summer project he and his daughter had once planned to build together. He's not my biological father. The words echoed, and as always, Robert didn't react. He simply lowered his head and gave a small nod. Not in agreement, just a quiet nod. To tell himself, I gave everything, and now I have to learn how to let go. That afternoon, the air turned suddenly cold. Low-hanging clouds draped over the neighborhood, as if someone were holding back a storm that hadn't yet found the courage to fall. Robert stood trimming a small shrub by the porch. His hands paused over a few dry branches, his eyes drifting to the faded brick pavement. Where Eleanor, at age 8, had once drawn clumsy pink chalk hearts. His heart beat faster than usual, not because of the sun, not because of exertion, but because the words still echoed in his mind. He's not my biological father. That's the truth. That evening, Sandra made grilled pork, Robert's favorite. She called for him several times. No answer, so she went out back. The garage light was on, the door left slightly ajar. Robert was slumped against the wall, one hand clutching the left side of his chest, sweat beading down his brow. Robert? Sandra's voice cracked as she rushed to him. Robert, what's wrong? He was breathing fast, not quite pain, not quite fatigue, just a crushing pressure in his chest. As if something invisible was pressing down with unbearable weight. No words, not even enough strength to whisper, I'm okay. Sandra's hands trembled as she grabbed her phone. Ambulance, please, hurry. My husband has a history of heart disease. He can't breathe. The hospital at night, fluorescent lights, the smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic tapping of nurse shoes on tiled floors. Sandra sat curled in a hard plastic chair in the hallway, hands clasped together, shaking. She had never seen her husband fall like that. Her Robert, who still worked 10-hour days, still changed light bulbs, still fixed leaky pipes, and always said, I'm fine, was now lying in an emergency room because his heart simply couldn't hold on anymore. Near midnight, the doors swung open. A man in a white coat stepped out, removing his mask. Dr. Miller. Mrs. Taylor? Sandra shot to her feet. His condition is stable, for now, but his heart's showing clear signs of weakness. It was a minor infarction, not the first. It's likely been building for months. Her hand flew to her mouth, tears pooling in her eyes. He never said anything, not once. Some people are like that, the doctor replied gently. They're good at enduring, but that doesn't mean their bodies forgive them. When Sandra was finally allowed to see him, Robert was awake. his eyes still warm, but his voice low, worn. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." Sandra sat beside him and took his hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" Robert stared at the ceiling, no tears, but his eyes were red. "Because if I told you, you'd tell Elena. And I didn't want her to think I was bringing it up to gain her sympathy. I don't need her gratitude. I just want her to be happy, even if, in her eyes, I'm just your husband." Sandra tightened her grip on his hand. "You don't have to give someone life to be their father, Robert. But a father sometimes needs to be recognized as the one who gave his child his whole heart." He squeezed her hand, gave a small nod. No more words, but that night, beneath the sterile glow of hospital lights, his heart, though tired, kept beating. Not for his own life, but because he still loved the girl, who had forgotten who he was. Robert was discharged 3 days later, sent home with a follow-up schedule and a thick list of prescriptions. He quickly resumed his old habits, waking early, sipping weak tea, trimming hedges in the yard, and deflecting any deeper questions with his usual refrain. "I'm fine." Sandra stopped asking, but she knew some silences don't protect a man. They slowly kill him from the inside by starving his pride. One late night, after Robert had gone to bed, Sandra climbed up into the attic. That familiar space, still thick with the scent of old wood and dust from winters long past. She searched until she found the silver tin box labeled Elena Childhood. She opened the lid. Layer after layer of memories surfaced, and nestled in the center a white envelope, unsealed, with 3 simple words written on the front. "To Elena." She recognized the handwriting instantly. Slanted, tidy, with a slight tremble at the end of each stroke. Robert's writing, from when he tried to mask emotion with control. Sandra sat on the wooden floor, switched on a small flashlight, and gently opened the letter. She read every word, every syllable. She folded the letter back carefully. Her hands shook, not from anger, but from pain, for a man who had mastered the art of quiet endurance so well, that even his own daughter never realized how deeply he had once loved her. The next morning, while Robert was in the garden, Sandra quietly stepped into the study. She took a fresh envelope and placed the letter inside, along with a stamped copy of a hospital billing statement that read, "Paid in full, payor Robert Taylor." Then she walked, block by block, steady though heavy-footed, until she reached the neighborhood's largest mailbox. She stood there a moment, exhaled slowly, and let the envelope fall in. Without a single note, without any explanation, without blame, just the truth, sent whole, untouched by bitterness or pity. Sandra returned home. She still made tea, still wiped down the counter. She didn't tell Robert what she had done, because some things don't require permission. They only need to be done. For the one you love, who may never stand up to claim what he deserves. Friday morning. The dormitory mailbox at Madison University clicked open with a soft clack. Eleanor had just stepped out of applied philosophy, her mind still drifting somewhere between Nietzsche and her summer research proposals. As usual, she paid no attention to the pile of mail stuffed into box 308 until her eyes caught a plain white envelope. No school logo, no official header. Just 3 simple handwritten words, "To Eleanor Carter." No return address, nothing flashy, but the handwriting. She recognized it instantly, that slight rightward slant, the rounded loops, the faint tremble at the end of each word. Robert's handwriting. Her breath caught. She tore the envelope open at the edge. Inside, a folded sheet of paper in pale blue ink, and a printed tuition receipt from the university's billing system. At the top right corner, one line stood out in bold, "Paid in full, payer, Robert Taylor." Eleanor froze. Her hands trembled slightly. She unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned each line. And with every word, it felt less like reading from a page, and more like confronting everything she had chosen to ignore these past few years. "Elena, I know. Or rather, Uncle knows I'm not your biological father. But do you remember the day you held my hand in the park and asked, "Why don't you have kids of your own?" I couldn't answer, because in that moment, I wished I could say, "I do. You're right here." The Mustang was the only thing I kept for myself after everything fell apart. But it wasn't worth more than the smile on your face, the day your acceptance letter arrived. If paying your tuition meant helping you soar, then it was the easiest decision I ever made. And one day, when you have a family of your own, you'll understand. The ones who give us DNA aren't always the ones who truly raise us. I don't need you to call me Dad. I just want you to know I've always been there. From the very beginning. Robert. She read it again and again. Each time the words remained the same dash dash. But she was no longer the same. The bench in the courtyard suddenly felt too fragile to hold her weight. Her eyes burned. Her fingers gripped the edge of the letter until her nails left indents on the paper. She remembered the gala, the way she had walked toward the crowd, introduced him, and never even paused to look at him. The way she had said, "My mother's husband," when just one word, "Dad," could have changed everything. Eleanor folded the letter, carefully, tenderly, as if it might break if mishandled. Above her, a leaf drifted gently down through the air. She stood up, and for the first time in months, she dialed home. The screen lit up, the call connected, it rang, and this time, the man on the other end finally heard it ring. The call connected after 2 rings. On the other end, Robert was holding a cup of tea on the back porch. His phone vibrated softly on the wooden table. He looked down at the screen. A single line lit up. Elena calling. His heart skipped, gently, not out of nervousness, but because... How long had it been? He picked up the phone, answered. "Hello?" No response right away, just the sound of wind rustling through the speaker. Then a quiet voice, no formal greeting, no introduction. Just a sentence, trembling. "I read it." Robert didn't reply. His lips pressed into a line. His eyes gazed off toward the fence, where Mark, the neighbor's boy, had practiced riding his bike with him just yesterday. "I didn't know. You did that much." Eleanor's voice broke slightly, as if pushing past the tightness in her throat. "I thought I understood everything, but I didn't see a thing. I assumed everything was just given. I thought it was your duty. She paused, a breath, a swallow. "I treated you like you were just someone on the outside." Still, Robert said nothing, but he listened. And he felt Dash. Each breath from her mouth weighed heavy, like the breaths he took alone that night in the empty garage. Then Elena's voice lowered again, as if afraid someone might overhear, or perhaps afraid she could no longer hold it in. "That night on stage, I should have said Dad, just one word, but I didn't. I don't even know why. Maybe pride, maybe stupidity, maybe I just wasn't grown up enough to say the name I should have said a long time ago." Silence, 1 beat, 2 beats, then... Robert smiled, not big, not showy, but it was the first smile in weeks that wasn't forced. He raised the phone closer to his ear and said softly, "Dad's still here." On the other end, Elena cried, not sobs, just quiet, broken breaths, like a child who had just found something she thought was lost forever. "I'm sorry." One sentence, but for the first time, it didn't have the word uncle in it. Robert closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wooden frame of the door. "It's okay. I just was afraid you'd stop calling." The call ended after 5 minutes. Not long, no grand speeches, but in Robert's heart, every word echoed louder than all the applause at that university gala. Because for the first time, she didn't forget to call him Dad. And for the first time, he finally heard the name he had been waiting his whole life to be called. The old iron gate still creaked the same way, a long familiar screech as it swung open. The taxi pulled up in front of the house, its tires nudging the curb she'd known all her life. Eleanor stepped out, bag in hand, her eyes scanning each stone in the walkway. Everything exactly as it was. But inside her, everything had changed. She stood motionless at the front door for a few seconds, taking a deep breath. Not to muster courage to enter, but to keep the tears already slipping from the corners of her eyes from falling too fast. For the first time, this house felt warm and full of remorse. The door opened. Sandra rushed out first. Before she could say anything, Elena threw her arms around her, a tight, almost desperate embrace. She whispered, her voice cracking, "I read everything. I know now, Mom." Sandra just held her tighter, her hand gently patting her daughter's back. There was nothing else to say. Not now. At the end of the hallway, Robert sat in his usual padded chair by the window. The one where he'd spent so many sleepless nights listening to the crickets outside. He stood slowly, a slight tremble in his movement, but his eyes softened the moment he saw Eleanor walk in. She let go of her mother, took a slow step forward, then knelt in front of Robert. Her hands reached out and gently took his. "Dad, I'm home." Not Uncle, not him. This time, Dad. Clear, willing. No one asked her to say it, no pride holding her back. Robert looked down. His whole face seemed to tighten, like he was holding back something far too big to name. "I've always been right here, you know that." Elena nodded. Tears fell freely now. But they were no longer tears of guilt. They were tears of realizing how deeply she had been loved, in silence. The whole house settled into a quiet stillness. No one spoke. No one needed to. Elena rested her head on his shoulder, and for a long moment the air stood still. Outside, the evening sun filtered through the old curtains, casting a soft golden glow over everything. From Robert's silver hair to Elena's tear-streaked cheeks. The garage was still empty. The Mustang was long gone. But what Elena found today wasn't a car. It was a father dash, one she had never given the chance to be called by his rightful name. The soft morning light spilled gently through the kitchen window. Robert sat at the old wooden table, hands wrapped around a cup of hot tea. Sandra was making breakfast, and Elena was still out on the porch. She sat alone on the old swing chair, the one he had once re-bolted after it became wobbly. Her gaze was fixed on the small backyard, where a toy windmill still stood, the one he'd assembled for her when she was little. She had wanted pink. All he could find was a faded, unfashionable green. Robert stepped out slowly. He said nothing, just sat down beside her. Silence lingered. Only the soft wind weaving through the vine trellis, making little golden shadows dance across the porch floor. Eleanor lowered her head. "I used to think, if someone didn't share your blood, they couldn't really be family. But I was wrong, Dad." She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the yard dash, as if afraid that turning to face him might make her crumble. "I hurt you, not once, but again and again, every time I refused to say your name. I let my pride, my thoughtlessness, and the arrogance of youth blind me." Then she turned to look at him. "I'm sorry." Robert didn't answer, but he raised his hand. That hand, rough, worn from machines, motor oil, and decades of labor under the sun, reached gently to her hair, then rested softly on top of her head, just like he used to do whenever she fell off her bike as a child. A wordless gesture, but it spoke everything. Elena broke down in tears, but this time in the arms of the man she had once denied. Robert looked out over the yard. "You don't have to call me Dad if you don't want to. Just come home. And stay." Eleanor gripped him tighter, voice trembling. I want to. No one's forcing me to. But today, it's a word I choose." Inside the house, Sandra quietly wiped away tears behind a half-closed door. Morning light spilled across the two of them, casting a small golden glow on the weathered porch floor. A father who never asked for a title, a daughter who only wanted to be forgiven, and a family finally made whole again, not by words, but by the kind of silence that heals more than anything ever said. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon. The breeze was light, the sky crisp with golden sun. In the backyard, Robert was mowing the lawn, each step slower, more deliberate than before. But he didn't complain. Not once. Inside the kitchen, Elena was busy. Not like before. This time she had asked her mother how to cook the beef curry her dad used to love. Her hands were clumsy, but her eyes were steady. "Is your dad coming back soon?" "Not yet, Mom, but someone special is arriving this evening." Sandra looked at her daughter and smiled. She didn't ask anything more. Late afternoon. The sound of an engine rolled in from the end of the street. Robert looked up, squinting toward the driveway. A car pulled in, not one he recognized. It was a brand new Mustang, deep blue with silver trim gleaming in the sun. Robert stood still. The car door opened. Eleanor stepped out, holding a small wooden box, walking toward him with a quiet smile. "Recognize it?" Robert didn't answer. He stepped forward, hand trembling as he reached out to touch the hood. As if unsure it was real. "I used my summer research scholarship. Couldn't buy back the exact car you once sold, but..." She opened the wooden box. Inside, the original steering wheel from the old Mustang, returned by the current owner after hearing the story. He said, "You never bargained. You only asked one thing. Can I give you the money today?" Robert said nothing, but his eyes welled with red. "I can't recover the memories you gave up, Dad, but I can start making new ones. With you." Eleanor held out the keys. "Today you're driving." Robert looked at her, then at the car. Then he nodded, slowly but firmly. The whole family climbed in. Sandra sat in the back, smiling quietly. Eleanor took the passenger seat beside Robert, her eyes glowing with the warmth of sunlight through the windshield. The engine roared to life, smooth, gentle, but in Robert's chest it sounded like something being restored, not with medicine, but with love. They pulled away from the curb. Wind brushed through the cracked windows, and a new journey began. Not toward any destination, but back toward one another. A calm, gentle morning. Sunlight spilled evenly across the porch. Birdsong drifted through the window. Everything looked ordinary, as if nothing remarkable was happening. But for Eleanor, every second inside this house now felt extraordinary. Robert was crouched next to a small bicycle. Mark's bike, the neighbor's little boy who was still learning to ride. He tightened a bolt, adjusted the handlebars, then gave the seat a soft pat, like a sacred ritual. Mark climbed on, wobbling. "Don't look down at the wheels. Look ahead," Robert said, steady and patient. From a distance, Eleanor stood in the doorway, cradling a warm cup of coffee. She didn't interrupt. She didn't call out. She simply watched. She had once been that child, and it was those same hands, that same gaze, that had taught her how to ride. Not just a bicycle, but through life, with quiet faith and persistence. Sandra stepped out, gently draping a light scarf over her daughter's shoulders. "Did you finish writing it?" Elena nodded. Her hand gently pressed the folded paper in her jacket pocket. A letter, this time written by her. Inside the living room, the letter now sat neatly on the mantel, beside the old Mustang steering wheel. "Dad, I used to think a real father was the one who gave you life, but now I understand. Not everyone who gives you blood gives you their heart. I'm sorry for not saying the name you always deserved to hear, but you stayed. When I was distant, when I disappeared, when I refused to see you as Dad. Now I do. Not because of today, not because of a letter, but because I finally grew enough to understand what's been true all along. Thank you, Dad, for being the one who stayed." Outside, Robert helped Mark up after his first fall. He didn't scold, just smiled. Eleanor stepped off the porch, walking toward them. A father who never left, a daughter who found her way back, and loved Ash. Forgotten for a while, but strong enough to heal once it's finally called by its rightful name. He never needed to be called Dad. Just knowing she was happy was enough for him to carry every unspoken hurt. But sometimes, even a single word spoken too late can still heal a lifetime of silent sacrifice. If you've had someone like that in your life, don't wait for a special occasion. Say their name, hug them, thank them while you still can. And if this story touched you, share it with someone who's ever loved in silence. Because being a father has never required blood, only heart.